Hello everyone. Welcome to this session. Thank you very much for joining me for this brief talk that I'm going to deliver today. As part of Women's History Month, the School of History, Philosophy and Social Sciences at Bangor University are releasing a series of mini talks celebrating the contributions of different women throughout history, and today it's my chance, my opportunity to discuss a female figure I find particularly interesting and most deserving of commemoration during this very important month, that being Women's History Month. And the individual I'm discussing today and going to commemorate is Sojourner Truth. So a bit of introduction. Sojourner Truth was an African American abolitionist, meaning that she worked to abolish slavery. She was against slavery. She had personal experience of actually being enslaved, and she became well known for being a staunch abolitionist. She was also a campaigner for women's rights, so she would work to ensure that women were heard, women were treated equally or treated better than in the past. And she was also an evangelical Christian. She was a staunch Christian. Her religion became one of her main characteristics, became one of those stapled elements of her as an individual. Now, she was born in 1797 and her original name was Isabella Baumfree. She changed her name to Sojourner Truth later on in life, and we'll discuss that change later on in this talk. Now, she was born to slave parents in Ulster County, New York, meaning that she was a slave from birth. So she had exact personal accounts of being an enslaved individual. When she was about 9 years old, she was sold at auction for $100. So she was sold in a public auction, a similar type of auction to those experienced by animals, or those auctions which sell goods like furniture, household goods, etc. She was sold as a piece of property, not as a person. She was not treated as a person. She was sold as property. Now, we know that her master, her owner, was a very violent person, and Isabella did suffer greatly at his whims. She did suffer endlessly, in a sense, daily, usually. And as part of this suffering, she was forced to marry another slave on the farm who was called Thomas, although Isabella was in love with a slave from another farm. But obviously her master said that she had to marry this Thomas, and because she was a slave, she had no right to say otherwise. In the end, she bore 5 children: James, Diana, Peter, Elizabeth, and Sophia. Now, liberation or emancipation became an important element in Isabella's life. With the turn of the 19th century, New York began legislating liberation and emancipation throughout its state. Now, Isabella's owner promised that she could be liberated on the 4th of July 1826 if she would, and I quote, "do well and be faithful." The 4th of July 1826 arrived, but Isabella was not emancipated. The slave owner, the master, did not stick to his word. However, she fled. She left her master and her children behind, apart from Sophia, the youngest. Now Isabella went to New Paltz in New York, where she and her daughter were taken in by a couple called Isaac and Maria van Wagenen. Now, when her master finally caught up with her, he demanded that his property be returned to him. But when that happened, the couple, Isaac and Maria van Wagenen, offered to buy Isabella for $20 and for her to stay enslaved to them until the anti-slavery law of New York would be enforced and would free all of the slaves of the state in 1827. The master agreed, and Isabella was purchased for $20. And then subsequently she was freed. Now religion played a very important role in Isabella's life, especially from her time with Isaac and Maria van Wagenen. Both of the van Wagenens were staunch Christians, and they influenced Isabella greatly. In 1829, Isabella moved to New York City with Peter, her son, to work as a maid to the evangelical preacher Elijah Pearson. So she was in contact with important Christian figures, the leading Christian preachers of the day, and she was in close contact with them. She was in such close proximity that she also became inspired by Christianity, by the Christian gospel, by the Christian message, by Christian preaching. 3 years later, she worked for another preacher called Robert Matthews. Again, she was overcome by Christian sentiments. She was so submerged in religion that this had a great effect on her. So much so that she decided to preach herself. She wanted to partake in that work of converting people, converting as many as possible to Christianity. And as part of this new wave of feeling and sentiment, she changed her name from Isabella Bomfrey to Sojourner Truth. Sojourner being an individual who resides in a country which isn't their own, similar to Isabella, obviously from African descent, being a sojourner, sojourning in the United States, and truth. She was there to preach truth, nothing but the truth, and her life was devoted to the Christian message. With this, she began preaching. She preached the Christian message. She became a leading individual. She criticized slavery and every type of oppression, and she preached in favor of women's rights. Now, for the abolition element, where she criticized slavery and championed abolitionism, an example of that type of action was 1844. She joined an abolitionist movement in Massachusetts called the Northampton Association of Education and Industry, and there she met great abolitionists, including the former slave Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass being a well-known individual, quite a prominent individual with regards to abolitionism, and there we see Sojourner Truth meeting this staple of a man, this very significant individual during the age. In 1851, Sojourner Truth continued preaching about equal rights to black women, and she did so in the Ohio Women's Rights Convention, and there she met several key women's rights campaigners, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And there, in that convention in Ohio, she made a speech, and that speech would become well known and famously linked to Sojourner Truth, when she continually asked the question, "Ain't I a woman?" And here's just an extract from that speech. "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. And she says nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have ploughed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could heed me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman?" And she continues, "Then that little man in black there, he says women couldn't have as much rights as men, 'cause Christ wasn't a woman. Then she asks, where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him, with Christ." Then she continues, "If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone," obviously that being linked to the idea that Eve was responsible for the fall of man, for changing history and changing the world, she asks, shouldn't these women, all of these women in this congregation, in that convention at one time, couldn't women collectively turn the tables back, turn the situation back upright, and get it right side up again? And she says, and now they is asking to do it. The men better let them. Women want to have a more prominent role in society. And we see Sojourner Truth here stating, let them. They want to help. They want to change society. Let women have a voice. Let women have a footing. Let women be leaders in society. And she concludes, obliged to you for hearing me, and now old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say. She made such a name for herself with regards to abolitionism, in addition to women's rights, that she was even invited to the White House in Washington, D.C. by the then President Abraham Lincoln on October 1864. Then, in 1867, 3 years later, Sojourner Truth moved to Battle Creek in Michigan. There, she continued to argue against prejudice, racism, and for the rights of women, and she did so up until the end of her life, when she passed away on the 26th of November 1883. However, she has left a great legacy. We have her autobiography, The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, and I would suggest you read that autobiography. It's such an interesting book. It's such a powerful narrative. It's such a memorable piece of biographical literature. Several memorials have been placed in memory of her. Some buildings have been named after her. Some places have been located as memorials for her. However, there is room for improvement. We could do more to remember this exceptional woman. Yes, it's important for us to remember her during Women's History Month in March. It's paramount to remember her during Black History Month in October every year. But I would go as far to say it's important to remember her during other months as well, all year round. Remember the contribution of this significant woman. We should remember Sojourner Truth, the abolitionist, the women's rights activist, the preacher, the Christian preacher. We should remember this individual, this very remarkable woman, all year round. She is an important individual. She is a crucial character with regards to the development of abolitionism, and especially black women's rights. She should be remembered, she should be commemorated, and, most of all, she should be celebrated. Thank you very much for listening.